Ready to start? Okay, so this is the evening session on Saturday, September 2nd, 2017. So, wow, we've really covered a lot of material. So in the afternoon, we covered the 8 types of all the types of wholesome consciousness. That is the 8 types of sense sphere wholesome consciousness, the 12 kinds of unwholesome consciousness. Unwholesome consciousness is always necessarily sense sphere. So that's 8 rooted in greed, 2 rooted in hatred, and then 2 rooted in exclusively in delusion. And then we took the 5 types of wholesome fine material sphere consciousness. That is the consciousness that's present in the 5 fine material sphere jhanas, and the 4 types of wholesome immaterial sphere consciousness. That is the 4 types of consciousness that are inherent in the 4 immaterial meditative attainments. And then we took the 4 kinds of wholesome supramundane or world transcending consciousness. That is the states of consciousness that constitute the 4 supramundane or world transcending paths. The path consciousness that eradicates defilements and culminates in the attainment of liberation. So all of that domain of consciousness we covered in one afternoon. Okay, so now we come to indeterminate, what's called indeterminate consciousness. And this kind of consciousness is said to be of 2 kinds, the resultant and the functional. And to understand these types of consciousness, it will be helpful to look, sort of to turn away for a moment from the Visuddhimagga and to look at the comprehensive manual of Abhidhamma. It's page 155. Where we have a diagram showing the process of consciousness. Because according to the Abhidhamma, consciousness always occurs as a process, and this process consists in a series of states of consciousness. These states of consciousness are called chittas, individual, we call them momentary frames of consciousness. Just like a movie, at least in the old days, I don't know about the new technology, but in the old days, the movies that occur in a reel consists of frames. Each frame shows has a particular scene, and then those frames go by so quickly that you see the movie. And so what the Buddhist does, or the Buddhists in their meditative investigations, they sort of slow down the flow of consciousness. They don't actually slow it down, but through very intense contemplative mindfulness, they're able to see the unfolding of this momentary frames of consciousness. And so as they do so, then they group these frames or designate these frames in terms of particular stages in a process of cognition. So when we know any object, there are individual chittas that are arising and passing, each performing its own task, its own function in the act of cognition. And so this is a diagram that shows a complete process occurring in the eye door. That is a process in the act of seeing that occurs based on the eye faculty. Okay, now according to the Abhidhamma, consciousness actually occurs in two modes. One is the active mode, in which there's a distinct cognition taking place, where one is knowing something, and knowing in a broad sense, which will include even like experiencing emotions in response to something, where there's any kind of active conscious processes taking place. So that is called process consciousness. Then when there is no process consciousness, it doesn't mean consciousness has stopped, but what is occurring is a kind of passive and quiet flow of a kind of consciousness. That passive flowing consciousness is called bhavanga. Venerable Nyanamoli has translated that as the life continuum. But I think some of these terms, it's best simply to leave them untranslated. Since life continuum, if you hear the term, you don't really know what it means, so you ask, what is the life continuum? It's the bhavanga. Oh, so that's what you mean by life continuum. Okay, so this shows a process of consciousness in which the first three stages, the first three events, are actually moments of the bhavanga when an object has, this would be a visible form, has impinged on the eye faculty. Some visible form has made an impression on the eye faculty. So first, one moment of bhavanga flows by. Can you read it from this upside down or side position? That is called the the past bhavanga. I don't know if I rotate whether that's better. No. Okay, so here the only thing that's, you have to read sideways are the numbers. That's easier than reading print. Okay, so here is the stream of bhavanga flowing by, and even the stream of bhavanga is a series of individual states of consciousness, but all of those states of consciousness are the same. They're all the bhavanga consciousness, but it's one bhavanga, two bhavanga, 3, 4, 5, 6, one after another. And this is occurring countless times between, even while we're sitting here and talking right now, continually our mind is dropping into the bhavanga and then coming out of it. But it's going by so quickly that we don't recognize it. then the bhavanga becomes clearest when one goes to sleep and falls into dreamless sleep. Then the bhavanga is just flowing by without any interruption by active consciousness. Okay, in this case, some visible form has struck on the eye faculty. And so first, one moment of bhavanga just flows by passively. The next moment, the bhavanga is said to vibrate. Though a consciousness can't actually physically vibrate, but it's like a little shaking or disturbance is taking place in the bhavanga. At the third moment, the bhavanga, the stream of the bhavanga is cut off. So this one is called the arrest bhavanga. Not that the bhavanga is being arrested and brought to the police station, but it means that it's stopped. The bhavanga here stops. Okay, now a moment, a citta arises, an active consciousness called five-door adverting. So this consciousness, its task is to figure out that there's been something knocking on one of the sense doors. So its task is to figure out what sense door is being impinged upon. Maybe it's like having this hall like this with suppose we have 5 doors, 1, 2, 3, actually we do, 4, 5, and there's a knocking sound, and I'm sitting here, and I have to figure out, somebody's knocking, which door is it? And so this is the 5-door adverting. It just tries to figure out, where is that object coming from? What sense door is it knocking at? And then it turns to that sense door. The next moment is the I consciousness. And the I consciousness simply has the task of, we could say, photographing the form. It doesn't identify what the form is. This is a very complicated process that's taking place. It's like the camera that just takes in the image of the object that one is photographing. So the I consciousness just accepts the impression of the visible form. Then comes a consciousness that receives it, that sort of takes in that visible form, the impression of that form. Another consciousness which is said to investigate, to figure out what it is. Then comes a moment of consciousness called determining, which determines what that form is. And then this is followed by a series of 7 types of consciousness, or 7 cittas, which are all the same in type, but the 7 just follow one after another. And that type of consciousness is called javana. And it's in the stage of javana that there will arise the intentional or volitional response to the object. So it's in the stage of javana that the wholesome and the unwholesome cittas will occur. So if one has wise attention, or there's a strong, say, right view within the mind, or a person is being mindful, or they have strong, say, ethical impressions within their stream of consciousness, then when they respond to the object, likely a wholesome sequence, or sequence of wholesome states of consciousness will arise in the javana stage. But if the person habitually has an untrained, undisciplined mind, then it's likely that unwholesome states of consciousness or unwholesome cittas will occur in the javana stage. So if, let's say, a beautiful form comes into range, so if one is practicing mindfulness and restraint of the senses, then when one registers the beautiful form, then there will arise maybe some wholesome cittas in which one remains detached from the beautiful form. So these would be sense sphere wholesome cittas accompanied by knowledge. Say one understands even beautiful forms are impermanent, and so those beautiful forms won't attract the thought process. But if one doesn't have this restraint of the senses and this training and mindfulness and right view, then when the beautiful form comes in, then one wants to see it, to gaze at it more. So that would be states of consciousness accompanied by greed or by attachment. And if it should be a disagreeable form that arises, that appears, then in the jhavana stage, if one has a well-trained mind, then one will contemplate even that disagreeable form is impermanent, insubstantial, and it will go. But if one doesn't have a trained mind, and then the disagreeable form comes into range, then the response will tend to be one of aversion towards that form. So those would be states of consciousness rooted in hatred or aversion. Okay, so we have 7 states of consciousness in the jhavana stage. And then if the object is very clear, very distinct, the jhavana stage will be followed by 2 moments that are called registration, in which the thought process registers the impression of the object. If the object is not so clear and distinct, then the thought process or the cognitive process will end with the 7th jhavana, and there won't be the registration, the moments of registration. The scheme of the different cittas, it's quite incredible that this was all devised something like 300 years BC, the third century BC. Okay, we're going to deal more and more detail with these functions of consciousness tomorrow. But I'm just introducing this now so that we can understand how the resultant and functional cittas fit into the process of cognition. Now this map or scheme that we have here is a diagram showing a complete process in the eye door. And we would have a similar process in the ear, nose, tongue, and body doors. So in the case of the 5 physical senses, the process is all the same. But after one takes in the sense object through a sensory process, then one will turn it over in the mind and sort of digest it and ruminate on it and generate more mental processes without the immediate input of the senses, but purely within the mind. And the mind could also entertain its own objects, mental images, ideas, thoughts, impressions, judgments, and so on, without reference to the 5 sensory domains. So that is called the mind door process. And we have a diagram of the mind door process. Which is a little simpler. Okay, so this is called the limited jhavana process. This is a a process in the mind door. It's called limited because this is taking place in regard, it's taking place with sense sphere types of consciousness rather than the fine material sphere consciousness of the jhanas or of the immaterial consciousness of the immaterial attainments. So in this case, we have a purely mental object. So we start off with we'll take the case where there's a clear object. There is the flow of the bhavanga. Can you see back in the back? Let me increase. Okay, we start off the B, that is the flow of the bhavanga. Then comes this vibration, the V, where some mental object has come in through the mind door. And so there takes place a kind of disturbance, momentary disturbance. Then the flow of bhavanga is arrested, that's the A. Then this is replaced or followed by a chitta that is called mind door inverting. This is not turning towards any of the sense doors, but it's turning inward at the mind door to see what is that object that's presented itself within the mind. And then that is followed by 7 moments of javana, the response, the volitional or intentional response to that object. And then when it's a clear object, there'll be 2 moments of registration, and then the return to the flow of bhavanga. If the object is not clear, if it's obscure, then after the 7 moments of javana, there comes the immediate return to the bhavanga without registration. Okay, is this reasonably clear? Okay. Who said this is going to be a relaxing retreat? Who's feeling relaxed? Okay. So now we have the indeterminate is of 2 kinds, resultant and functional. First we go through these categories, then I'll elaborate. Okay, the resultant is of 4 kinds according to plane. So we have resultants of the sense sphere, of the fine material sphere, of the immaterial sphere, and then the supermundane resultant. Okay, the resultant of the sense sphere is of 2 kinds, the profitable or wholesome resultant and the unprofitable, or better, the unwholesome resultant. And now we have to explain or make it clear that the resultants themselves are neither wholesome nor unwholesome. Rather, this is the result of the wholesome and the result of the unwholesome. So in other words, to use a rather gross example from a sutta level, not the Abhidhammic level. Okay, when, say, I hit my dog cruelly with cruelty, I don't have a dog, don't worry, but suppose I do, I'm hitting it just out of meanness and cruelty. So those are unwholesome states of consciousness. So that is creating unwholesome karma. Okay, later, say, maybe later in this life, could be in a future life, somebody beats me up, and I'm experiencing painful sensations. Now those painful sensations, we can suppose, are the results of my karma of beating the dog, the unwholesome karma. Now it's the karma, the active, the deed that's unwholesome. When I'm experiencing the pain of getting beaten, that is the result. It's the result of the unwholesome, but in itself, it's not wholesome, not unwholesome. It's just indeterminate. Okay, so we have profitable or wholesome resultant and unwholesome resultant. Okay, the wholesome resultant is of two kinds, namely without root cause and with root cause. Okay, that without root cause is that devoid of any of the roots, either the wholesome roots or the unwholesome roots. And this is of 8 kinds. So the 8 kinds given here are eye consciousness, ear, nose, tongue, and body consciousness. So the 5 types of sense consciousness. So in this position here where we have eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, that one moment of consciousness that has the function of seeing forms, hearing sounds, and so on, according to the Abhidhamma, this is a result of some past karma. Then we have the mind element with the function of receiving. Consciousness. It seems that the numbers should have been placed over here. 35, 36, 37, 38. So this would be 35, 36, 37, 38. Body consciousness is 39. Then we have the mind element with the function of receiving. So this is the receiving consciousness over here. This also is a result of past karma. And these 2 types of consciousness, which are the result of past karma, can be the result of either wholesome past karma or unwholesome past karma. The investigating consciousness oh, I see now. Okay. Okay, now I see why I was puzzled. Okay. Okay, this is the wholesome resultant. So the wholesome resultant without root cause. So we have eye consciousness, which is a wholesome resultant, ear, nose, tongue, and body consciousness. Those are wholesome resultants. But there's also eye consciousness through body consciousness, which are unwholesome resultants, the result of unwholesome karma. Okay, now the mind, this seems to me to be something wrong here. Let me just do a check. Okay, now I see. Oh, okay, now I see. Now I see. Okay, I was confused. I'm sorry. Okay, number 34 is the eye consciousness. Then 35 is the ear, then nose, tongue, and body consciousness. So 35 to 38 covers these four types of consciousness. Then 39, that is, he shouldn't have put the comma there. The comma should have gone over there. That's why it misled me. Yeah, I have to re-edit it. This. Okay, so number 39, this is the mind element with the function of receiving. So that is this one chitta that has the function of receiving the form that has been taken in by eye consciousness. Or if it's a sound, it receives that impression of the sound taken in by ear consciousness. And so with the other senses. Then, number 40, 41, those are the two types of mind consciousness elements with the functions of investigating. Okay, now there are the consciousness that exercises this function of investigation can be accompanied by either of two feelings. If it's a bland, neutral object, the feeling that goes with this investigating consciousness is a neutral feeling, what's called equanimity. But if the object is especially beautiful, lovely, desirable, pleasant, then the investigating consciousness is accompanied by a pleasant feeling, what's called joyful feeling. So we have two kinds of investigating consciousness, two kinds of wholesome resultant investigating consciousness. That accompanied by neutral feeling, if it's a bland object, and that accompanied by a joyful feeling when it's a pleasant object. So all of these, from eye consciousness through receiving, through investigating, are resultant states of consciousness. And in the case we're taking here, these are results of wholesome karma. Okay, now we have some elaboration. Okay, so eye consciousness has the characteristic of being supported by the eye. So the eye consciousness arises based upon the eye faculty, and its task is to cognize visible data. And its function is that it takes only visible data as its object. The eye consciousness has nothing to do with sounds, nothing to do with odors. When you see maybe a dish of very delicious food, the eye consciousness just takes in the visible impression of the food. It will be the nose consciousness which smells the fragrance of the food. When you eat it, it will be the tongue consciousness that takes in the taste or flavor of the food, and then the texture of the food is taken in by body consciousness. So each of these types of sensory consciousness is supported by its own respective sense base and cognizes only, exclusively, the object corresponding to that sense faculty. Okay, now we come to what is called the resultant mind element. And this has, this text calls it the characteristic. I would say that this is really the function. The function is that of cognizing the data coming in through the five senses, whatever sense it comes in through, eye, ear, nose, tongue, or body, it receives the impression of that object. And so its function is to receive visible data and so on. So that's why this kind of consciousness is usually called in the Abhidhamma the receiving consciousness. Okay, then this is followed by the two kinds of resultant mind consciousness element without root cause. This has the function of investigating, and its characteristic is to cognize the six kinds of objects. Actually, when it's occurring in the sense doors, then it cognizes with the function of investigating, then it can cognize only the five kinds of sensory objects. But this type of consciousness also has some other functions, and in these other functions or other roles, it's able to cognize mental objects, purely mental objects. So we'll see as we go along how this type of consciousness, we call it the investigating consciousness because that is its most prominent role. But some states of consciousness have several functions, several roles. It's just like a person who might be, let us say he's a lawyer. So let's say he's a college professor. So we usually refer to him as Professor Jones. This is Professor Jones. Meet Professor Jones. Of course, Professor Jones is teaching 18th century British English literature, or professor of Greek philosophy, Greek and Roman philosophy, Professor Jones. But Professor Jones is married to Professor, let's say David Jones is married to his wife Mary. So for Mary, he's not Professor Jones, but he's Dave. And to his kids, he's a father of his kids. To his kids, he's not Professor Jones or Dave, but he's Daddy. And maybe at his club, his friends know him as Dave. So he has different roles. He's professor, and so we always call him, usually Professor Jones, but he's also a husband, a father, member of the club, and so on. And so we call this kind of consciousness, usually we call it the investigating consciousness, but it has some other roles besides investigation. And in those other roles, it can, besides the sensory objects, it could also take the mental objects. Okay, now here the text is explaining how this investigating consciousness is distinguished according to whether it is accompanied by the joyful feeling, the pleasant feeling, or the neutral feeling, equanimity. And so it explains that it's associated with joy when it's cognizing desirable or agreeable objects. And it's associated with equanimity when the objects are either moderately desirable or neutral. Okay, now it's saying this eightfold resultant consciousness without root cause is of two kinds. Maybe this is technical details we don't have to be so concerned about. Oh, no, okay, let us take a look at it. Okay, it's of two kinds because of having an invariable object and a variable object. It is of three. Okay, that which has an invariable object, that would be, let me test you. Which kinds have an invariable object? Always the same object of these 8 resultant types of consciousness. The state of consciousness takes only one kind of object, not any other kind of object. Of these 8, which... Right, exactly. The 5 types of sense consciousness. The eye consciousness takes only forms, the ear consciousness only sounds. So those 5 take only one type of object. But the receiving consciousness can receive the objects of any of the 5 types of sense consciousness. It can receive forms, sounds, odors, tastes, textures. And the investigating consciousness can also investigate the objects of any of the senses. And so that has a variable object, or it can take different kinds of objects. Then of 3 kinds, according to the accompanying feeling, the body consciousness takes pleasant feeling. The investigating consciousness, one of them takes joyful or pleasant feeling, and the others are always accompanied by neutral feeling. Okay, so now we've gone through the 8 kinds of wholesome resultant consciousness without root cause. Okay, now we come to the difficult one, difficult to understand, difficult to explain. And this is the types of wholesome resultant consciousness that have roots. And these types of wholesome consciousness that have roots include 42 to 49. Let's see which those are. Okay, not all that helpful. So let's go to the Comprehensive Manual of Abhidhamma. Okay, so this afternoon we went through the types of wholesome sense sphere chittas, and we saw the sense sphere, the wholesome sense sphere chittas, and we saw the 8 kinds that are associated with either joy or equanimity, some associated with knowledge, dissociated from knowledge, and so on. So those were the 8 kinds of wholesome sense sphere chittas. And now the resultant types of sense sphere chittas are exactly the same in terms of their associated factors, exactly the same as the wholesome cittas. Or we could say that they are the mirror image of the wholesome cittas, but they perform different functions. The wholesome cittas, the wholesome sense sphere cittas, occur in the role of javana. That is, those are the types of consciousness that create, in this case, wholesome karma. But those types of wholesome consciousness will produce as their result, or at least amongst their results, they will produce or give rise to their mirror image, the wholesome resultant sense sphere consciousness. And that is these consciousnesses listed here, 39 to 40. Okay, so it said that the resultant consciousness with root cause is that associated with the three wholesome roots of non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion. So those states of consciousness with knowledge, the four with knowledge, will have three wholesome roots: non-greed, non-hatred, and non-delusion. Because non-delusion and knowledge are synonymous. And those states of consciousness without knowledge, disconnected from knowledge, will have two wholesome roots: non-greed and non-hatred. But they don't have non-delusion. It's not that they are deluded, but they don't have non-delusion. Because non-delusion is equated with wisdom or knowledge, and that wisdom or knowledge is lacking. So the child who has delight, maybe when seeing a Buddha image and offers flowers to the Buddha image, will be generating a consciousness with non-greed and non-hatred, but the child has no knowledge of who the Buddha is, so there's no knowledge in that state of consciousness. Okay, so those wholesome states of consciousness with two roots or three roots produce as their result their sort of mirror image, their reflection, these 8 states of consciousness that have the beautiful roots: non-greed, non-hatred, and possibly non-delusion. Okay, the role of these states of consciousness, their function is different than that of the wholesome. The wholesome occur in the javana stage. The resultants occur with different functions, which I'm just going to mention here, but we're going to deal with this in more detail later in the presentation. So the functions of these resultant consciousness, we have them here, is rebirth linking. So that resultant consciousness is the consciousness that arises at the moment of rebirth. That is the rebirth linking consciousness, because it links the past existence to the new one. So the first state of consciousness that arises in the new existence, even in the womb, this is before, in the fetal stage, before emergence from the womb. That is the relinking consciousness, and that is a result of past karma. Then that consciousness performs the function of the bhavanga. So the bhavanga is a result of past karma, and in the case of wholesome karma of the sense sphere, the bhavanga will be a resultant consciousness, one of these 8 kinds of resultants. The resultant consciousness also performs the function of death. When death takes place, that one moment of consciousness with which one dies is a resultant consciousness resulting from the karma of the previous life. And then these types of resultant consciousness also perform the function of registration in that cognitive process. So these two moments, these two chittas, which are called registration, these are resultant consciousness, types of resultant consciousness. And if it's a wholesome karma that is generating these moments of registration consciousness, then it will be a wholesome resultant that performs the function of registration on these occasions. I know this is very dense and difficult to understand. It seems quite a lot to pack in just one day. Okay, so the Visuddhimagga says, here, this is an important point. While there is no difference in the associated states that is between the resultant, the wholesome resultant, and the actual wholesome state of consciousness that produces it, so the factors that enter into those states of consciousness are the same, but the resultant should be understood to be passive, like the reflection of the face in a mirror, while the wholesome is active, like the face itself. Okay, I think we could fit in the unwholesome resultants too. Okay, now we come to the unwholesome resultants. And now this is an interesting point, that the unwholesome resultant is always without root, without underlying roots. So even though unwholesome karma is created by the unwholesome roots of greed, hatred, and delusion, but the results of the unwholesome karma, the results of the unwholesome chittas or states of consciousness, those results do not have roots. They're necessarily rootless states of consciousness. And that's quite different from the wholesome states of consciousness. The wholesome states of consciousness produce results. Some of their results, like the eye, ear, nose, tongue consciousness, are without roots, but others, like those 8 types that we just went through, have the beautiful roots of non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion. And the reason for this is what my teacher explained to me many years ago, is because the wholesome consciousness is stronger and more powerful than the unwholesome consciousness. And because the wholesome consciousness is more powerful, it's capable of generating results that have roots. But even though it seems that greed and hatred can be extremely strong, but because of the nature of those states of consciousness, they're not able to generate results that have roots. So their results are always without roots. Okay, so here we come to the unwholesome resultants. And so this is of 7 kinds. And so here we have, similarly, eye consciousness, ear, nose, tongue, and body consciousness. So the 5 types of sensory consciousness can also be results of unwholesome karma. So we have 5 types of sense consciousness that result from wholesome karma. This would be generally when one gets to see something lovely, to hear nice sounds, to smell nice odors, to taste good food, to touch pleasant sensations with the body. And then when one sees disagreeable things, hears disagreeable things, and so forth, that is considered to come about as the result of unwholesome cittas. So these are unwholesome resultants. Similarly, the mind element with the function of receiving, that is can be an unwholesome resultant when it follows those kinds of sense consciousness that are unwholesome resultants. And then the investigating consciousness is also, or can also be an unwholesome resultant when the object it's investigating is disagreeable. Okay, so this next paragraph is just offering some distinctions between the wholesome resultants and the unwholesome resultants. So it says that the profitable or wholesome resultant has either desirable or desirable neutral objects, while the unwholesome resultants have undesirable or undesirable neutral objects. The wholesome resultants can be of three kinds: that connected with equanimity, like the five types of sense consciousness, or it could have bodily pleasure, like the body consciousness. Did I say that the 5 types of sense consciousness can be accompanied by equanimity? Then that was wrong. 4 types of sense consciousness are accompanied by equanimity: eye, ear, nose, and tongue consciousness. But the body consciousness is accompanied by pleasant feeling, always by pleasant feeling. And then the investigating consciousness can be accompanied by joy. But the unwholesome resultants will be accompanied either by bodily pain, in the case of body consciousness, or the other 6 types of unwholesome resultants will be accompanied by equanimity or neutral feeling. Okay, so we have 7 kinds of unwholesome resultants and 16 kinds of wholesome resultants. So that gives 23 kinds of sense sphere resultant consciousness. I think this is enough for today. So the rest of this period, for 30 minutes, we open the door to questions. And you could ask questions about anything that we covered in the course of the day. Yeah, please.
So my
your name is?
My name's Annie.
Annie.
Annie, yeah, Bande. So according to your teaching today, seems like chitta always happen in sequence rather than in parallel. But
in a single individual.
But you know, nowadays society, people like play with their phone and talking to you at the same time, and when you get mad, they'll say, I'm just multitasking.
Oh, when people are multitasking.
Yeah, so can I tell them, according to the Abhidhamma, there's no such thing as multitasking?
Yeah, actually, when it seems that one is multitasking, according to the Abhidhammic way of explanation, what is actually taking place is many sequences of cittas occurring in very quick succession. Mm-hmm. And so it seems that one is doing several things at the same time, but when one gets to the micro level, the microscopic level, there's actually one series of cittas is doing one thing, followed quickly by another series which is doing something else, followed by another series doing something else. So you have to tell your friends, just let the sequences of cittas continue to be occupied with the same object and to be engaged in the same task, at least for a sustained period of time. Don't be switching the object very quickly, otherwise you go crazy. Okay, Venerable Sudasso.
So I'm puzzled by the idea that there can be states of mind which have neither wholesome nor unwholesome roots. It seems like there's always going to be either greed or non-greed, either hate or non-hate, either delusion or non-delusion.
Yeah.
How can there possibly be a mind that has none of these?
Yeah, this is because, we'll take the simplest example, would be the bare sensory consciousness. So in a bare sensory consciousness, before there's any response, say to a visible form, just the impression of the consciousness which just takes in the impression of the object, that, in that state of consciousness, there's neither greed, hatred, and delusion, nor the absent, or the opposite, non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion, which are understood, non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion are understood not simply to be the absence of the three unwholesome roots, but those are actually sort of negative ways of expressing positive qualities. So in, say, the bare sensory experience before any response or reaction takes place, there's just no moral dimension to that aspect of the experience. It's a purely receptive type of experience. Annie? The second Annie? Okay.
This is Annie Michelle Tan. Since Bande said we can ask any kind of question, right?
I have to say, any kind of question pertaining to the subject matter that I'm covering. I'm not saying any question related.
Oh, no, it's also according to Abhidhamma. Since we joined this year, it's the 5th year, and I was so happy today, like we do a very good conclusion for past 4 years teaching. And then I think if Bande we agree with that, we like to have a certificate to complete 5 years Abhidhamma, because I was really happy with this, and I'm really proud of you. You're
really
explaining, very happy and very proud of you, because you express so well, explain it so detailed. And then I think for 5 years, I spend every Labor Day weekend here.
Yeah.
And then I like to have a certificate. It's with Bandes. Yeah, and I think I see a lot of students here really join for 5 years. And every one of them really accept and then can have it.
Yeah, but...
Are you agree?
Really, what I should have done is to have given the certificates last year for those who had attended consistently the 4-year program on the comprehensive manual of Abhidhamma. So if anybody can truthfully say that they attended at least the bulk of those 4-year
Yes,
4 weekends, then we should make up a certificate saying that you passed or that you completed the course on the comprehensive manual of Abhidhamma. But this weekend, we're beginning a new series.
And
so
I remember last year, Bande say we still have a last chapter, and then we will complete it in next year's. So I will say, oh, okay, let us come to join it and complete it.
Yeah, so if anybody attended the 4 Abhidhamma sessions, 2013, 14, 15, and 16,
just sign the name.
All 4 of them, then they should get a certificate. You could tell me.
So
but
can
now
we sign the name?
You've started the first one of a 3-year series. So this is 2017, then you have to come 2018, 2019.
Okay.
Then you get the second certificate.
Okay.
But maybe for this one, I'll give a test.
Don't
Only
worry,
those who
that was
pass
the
the
next
test
3
get
years,
the
right?
certificate.
So we will get for last year's. So everyone should sign the name on it?
Yeah, those who attended all 4 years
Okay.
can get a certificate.
Okay, everyone so happy here.
We'll have to make up a sheet,
Oh, okay. Thank
a
you so
sign-up
much.
sheet. Okay, but let's get questions. Yeah.
Emilio, hi Bhante. I'm back to this afternoon question
Yeah,
for which you promised me an answer this evening, but probably I didn't get the answer or didn't understand the answer regarding self.
yeah.
What moved during the rebirth, right? We
Well,
say all the aggregate are impermanent.
Yeah.
Form is impermanent,
Yeah.
feeling are impermanent, perception is impermanent, and I assume consciousness is
Yeah.
also impermanent.
Yeah, they're all impermanent,
Okay.
yeah.
So when we say when a person, there is the rebirth of that person,
Yeah,
there is not actually what moved from a life to the next one.
Okay.
As I understood
Okay.
from what you said
Okay.
earlier, you said it's basically the craving for existence.
well,
So it's
I
more
would say, what I would say is that it's the craving that drives the process of consciousness on from one existence to the next.
okay. So is the consciousness that moves from one
It is
existence.
the stream of consciousness that moves from one existence to the next.
Okay, that process you saw early on that
Yeah,
page.
well, that is a process occurring within a life, but what sort of underlies the continuity of the life process is that type of consciousness called the bhavanga.
Okay.
Yeah, the bhavanga is, Nyanamoli translates the life continuum. So that is what maintains the continuity of life, say within a single existence. It maintains our continuity from our conception up to death. And then with death, then the bhavanga is going to flow on to a new existence and then bring about the process of rebirth into the new existence.
Okay. But it's not the same consciousness. For that
It's not
reason,
a single
it's considered
consciousness.
impermanent.
It's a stream of consciousness. And so there's continuity because the bhavanga, it's moments of consciousness that arise and pass away, arise and pass away. So that stream or succession of occasions or moments of bhavanga, that flows on from one existence to the next.
To the next one.
And at some level, it preserves sort of traces or potencies created by all of our habits, tendencies, dispositions, as well as the wholesome and unwholesome karma.
Okay, thank you.
May I ask a related question?
Yeah, please.
So,
So you could stand up.
Oh, okay. So, what about you talked briefly about the death, the chuti chitta.
Yeah.
So, could you speak about how does that, goes into the next life or whatever?
I
like
think
that?
that's going to come up tomorrow. Yeah, this will all come up tomorrow. So just hang on till we get to it. Okay, see you.
Can I also?
Oh, you have another question?
Maybe
Bhante, I have this question, probably require maybe asking for a clarification. So, this sense of self and even like, yesterday's during the sutta section, sense of self and identifying a self in one of the aggregates,
Yeah.
those are two different things. The sense of self
Okay.
and seeing a self within one of the five aggregates,
Right. Yeah.
those are very two different things, aren't they?
I'd say that there's a difference between them. They're not entirely different in that you could see a connection between them. That is, the sense of self is something that arises, of course, first. It's more fundamental, more primordial. And that is actually, technically, we would call that, in Buddhist terminology, it's the asmimana. It's the conceit, I am, which is not the conceit of thinking I'm better than others, but it's just the sort of background idea that there is an I here, that there is some self here. And then one seeks to find some identity for that self, to give it some kind of content, and then one looks at the different components of one's being, and one thinks, what am I? This is especially those with a philosophical bent. Though probably ordinary people also do it unconsciously. Then one identifies, I'm the body, I am feeling, I am perception, my ideas, I am volition. It's sort of identify with my drive to do things, to accomplish things. Or at a more philosophical level, one identifies that I with the consciousness, that I am the pure awareness.
So, like when they talk about like stream entry, it's just that identification that drops off.
Right.
You still have that asmi mana. You said,
Exactly.
I am.
Yeah, that asmi mana, that sense of I or self, that is eliminated only by the arahat. Even the non-returner has it.
May I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
So, like when people talk about, in the suttas, Buddha, when explaining stream entry, it's always with regard to the 5 aggregates, whereas, for example, here the soils, like the soils, like the soils for the wisdom to...
Oh, the soil for wisdom, yeah.
So, it seems like even though there are many other topics like ayatanas, it's really these 5 aggregates, understanding them is really crucial to stream entry. Is that right?
Yeah, it seems to me, and this is just a conjecture, that there's a little bit of a difference in emphasis. Of course, one has to apply the contemplation of non-self to the sense spaces as well, but it seems that the 5 aggregate scheme is laid out for the purpose of removing the sense of self-identity, the identification with self, or the view of self, and also the conceit of I am, whereas the emphasis in the sense spaces is on eliminating the craving, because it's through the sense spaces that the feeling arises, and then that feeling becomes the food or the trigger for craving. So there seems to be a little, of course, both the view of self and craving will adhere to whether the 5 aggregates or the 6 sense spaces, but there's still a little difference in the emphasis. Okay, okay, Ming?
Yes, Bendy, thank you. And you gave a very nice story about the resultant theta, how it manifests in the 5-door process. Like you beat the door and you get, and the next life you get hurt.
I don't beat my dog.
You get tell a story, just demonstrate. Yes, demonstrate that. I wonder if it's you can give another example. Say if you do something and then the resultant theta is show up in the mind process.
In the mind process.
Yes.
You see, the thing is that the types of mind consciousness in the mind process are, let me just take another look at it.
Yeah. This is the mind process.
Okay.
But resultant
okay, this is the mind process in the sense sphere.
Yeah.
And you could see, okay, these are the three bhavanga citas. So these are just the passive flowing consciousness. Then there comes mind door adverting. This is a functional type of consciousness. It's not a karma resultant. And that is followed by the javana. So we don't have the types of sensory, you see the sensory consciousness and the receiving consciousness.
Yeah.
Those are karmic resultants. But
Yes,
in
so
the mind door process, we don't have the karmic resultants except the registration consciousness. That is considered karmic result.
Okay, so the resultant theta can't show up, can't manifest just no reason in the mind process, say, right? That means?
It doesn't show up so clearly in the mind or process, the karmic results. To give a good example, I have to resort to the sensory types of consciousness.
Okay, let's say this, and then what kind of mind like this? For example, if somebody say, Min is really bad.
Somebody says?
Somebody say, Min is a bad person. That is a sound. So it's coming from the ear, right?
Yeah.
And then it processes. But then, after that, it's pure mind processing. Min is bad. Why she say that?
Okay. I think what would be said, looking at this from the karmic point of view, is that somebody says you're a bad person, or I'm a bad person. Okay, so it would be the ear consciousness, the hearing consciousness.
Just once.
Okay, that is a karmic result, the unwholesome karmic result. The receiving consciousness is a karmic result. The investigating consciousness is a karmic result. So those three moments of consciousness are resultant.
Yeah.
And then what follows that, okay, there comes the determining consciousness, which determines, the significance of what's said. Okay, then in the javana stage, like if I don't have a trained mind, then if I'm insulted, then anger arises.
Yes, anger.
So the hating consciousness. If I have a trained mind, then I will think, when this person insults me, they are acting with a bad mind, so they are creating trouble for themselves. So then I might respond with sympathy towards that person, or with equanimity. If one response is to develop like loving kindness towards that person, wishing may that person be well and happy. And that way one is generating a wholesome mind. Or one can just respond to the sound, or to the words, develop a response of equanimity, thinking this person is foolish, their words are just vibrations in the air. They're just striking upon the ear faculty, and hearing is taking place. These words are permanent vibrations of sound. Then one is using insight as a way to deal with that.
Yeah, and then for example, like in this example, if a person like me is bad, just one sentence, but I probably be angry for like 10 minutes. During that 10 minutes, that is just repeat. That's why it makes me feel this kind of resultant theta. But you say it's not. Then what this?
Yeah, no. The angry thoughts that are continuing for 10 minutes, those are not resultants.
Then it's looping. What type of the mind process of that? Like the beginning point is what? It's functional.
Yeah, the starting point is the unwholesome resultant, which is the ear consciousness, receiving.
But I mean,
then as one is dwelling on it again and again, that is not the resultant.
Okay.
Those are states of, actually those are mind door processes, because you're not immediately hearing the words anymore. You're just remembering the words. And then, so there's the mind door adverting, which is turning to the words that you heard previously, even a few minutes ago, and then you're generating these javanas, which are accompanied by anger, by aversion.
I see. Thank you so much.
Okay. Is that Allison?
Yes.
Oh, you could stand up. Yeah.
Hi, Bhante. Follow that question. I have a question. Based on that example, from what I understand today you talk, is it will be the ear-door process.
Yeah.
And through that, receiving, investigation, and determination, and go through the ear jhavana. And that, from what I understand, we will create an intentional response.
Yeah.
Then after that, you registered. Then from there, you said, then transfer into my door process.
Yeah.
So from there, I decided saying, okay, I am bad. You are judging me. And I started registering. So I thought that's two. I thought that's two stage. One is the ear door process, and then my door process.
Yeah.
It's that. This is just my question is two process.
Yeah.
Instead of one process.
Yeah.
One is the ear door process, and second one is my door process.
Yeah.
And the my door process is simply mind. I mentally choosing the mental object, so I can create that mind door process repeatedly, right?
Yeah.
This is. I'm just asking. Is my understanding correct or is it not correct?
In a way, my explanations, I have to say, have been oversimplifying what is actually taking place, because it's explained that, say, when somebody speaks to me, they're actually, before I even understand what the person is saying, there's a whole series of cognitive processes are taking place in very rapid succession. Each of these is performing its own special task.
Yes.
So when I was saying that one responds to words of insult with either kindness or with equanimity or with anger, I was oversimplifying in order to make it easy to understand. But there will be, like, first a purely sense door process where you just take in the sound. Then there has to be a whole series of different mind door processes by which one understands the meaning of the words, connects the different words together to form a whole statement, then one recognizes the meaning of the statement, and then one arouses the response to that statement.
Okay, that's exactly what I understand. Because of that, I want to ask you two questions.
Yeah.
What I don't understand, the bhavanga at the beginning and at the end of all the door process.
Yeah.
That I don't understand truly.
Okay.
And the second is, I want to know what's the difference between the jhavana in five sense door process and my door process.
Okay. Two very difficult. Well, the first question, not that difficult. Second is difficult. Okay. The bhavanga, the life continuum, is a type of citta, or state of consciousness, that is occurring below the threshold of full awareness. And it's occurring constantly, all the time, between active cognitive processes. It is, maybe you call it the base level consciousness of an individual. So whenever there is no active cognition taking place, the mind stream drops into the bhavanga temporarily, then it emerges and engages in an active process. Then it drops into the bhavanga, comes up again, active process, dropping into the bhavanga, up again. And during our waking life, this is happening countless times, even as I said this afternoon, or maybe it was this morning, this afternoon, while we're sitting here, while I am speaking, you are listening, your stream of consciousness is constantly dropping into the Bhavanga, coming up, dropping in, coming up. It's a little bit like they say with the computer screen, that it's every split second, it's constantly sort of going blank and then reappearing, going blank, reappearing. But it's all occurring so fast that we don't see it. We're not able to discern it. We just see, I say, read the text here, and you just read it like it's continuous. On countless occasions, an object enters the range of cognition. Like you're just reading a solid, stable screen, which is there. But if we have our computer specialist here, who could tell us that the screen is constantly like, all of the pixels are going off, coming on, going off, coming on, countless times a second, and we're not able to perceive that.
Okay, so the Bhavanga in I-door process, that is the same arising when the my-door process, the Bhavanga is all the same.
The Bhavanga is not involved in the process, the active process. The Bhavanga is what gets cut off before a process begins, and when the process comes to an end, then the mind drops again into the Bhavanga.
I see.
But, so there's no matter about the Bhavanga of an eye-door process or the Bhavanga of an ear-door process. Okay. It's just that the Bhavanga is always the same, but when the Bhavanga ends, it might be followed by an eye-door process. When it ends, it might be followed by an ear-door process. But the Bhavanga itself is one type of citta, which just keeps on replicating itself over and over.
Could I ask you the following? The one type of citta is the same for all people? Is individual based?
No, everybody has their own Bhavanga, and there are certain types of citta that perform the function of Bhavanga. But I think I'm going to come to that tomorrow.
Okay.
And then as the second question, the types of javana, the difference between a javana in a sensory process and in a mind-door process. Yeah, the javana, I would say, in the sensory process is much more rudimentary, much more simpler, and can perform only very simple tasks. Whereas in the mind-door process, the javana can exercise much more complex and sophisticated tasks.
And from what I understand, you said in the javana stage, doesn't matter is in a five sense door process or mind door process, is always creating karma or intentional responses.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're going to you. Did you have the microphone?
May I?
Oh, okay. So you will ask the last question today. Then we'll.
It's a question about the scenario with the man who beat his dog.
Oh, that poor dog. Okay, go on.
So the resultant consciousness doesn't carry karma for the person who is beaten, but the individual who beats that man in response.
Say again.
So I understood that if someone beats a dog, later on they're beaten, they're hit, and it's a response to that earlier karma.
Okay, that's just a sort of maybe an oversimplified representation that I gave just to make the point clear, but go on.
But in that representation, when the person received that karmic beating, there was a person who did that beating. So another person who hit that dog beater. So the person who hits a person, and that result is for the person who is hit a karmic result. Does it still carry karma for the person who hits? Or are those two separate processes?
I'm not sure that I'm understanding. Let me just try to explain it again. Okay, the man hits the dog.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, he's doing this with a cruel thought. He enjoys inflicting harm or pain on others or not on animals, so he hits the dog. So he's creating unwholesome karma with those states of mind. Now that unwholesome karma stays with the man who hit the dog, and it has the potential to produce results coming back to him. So it could be later in this life, if that karma matures, then he undergoes some kind of painful result. He gets beaten up by others.
Exactly.
Or if it doesn't ripen in this life, that karma might follow him into the next life or some later life. And then in the next life or the later life, he might get beaten as the result of beating the dog.
But my question is that if he receives a beating from someone else,
yeah.
which is a karmic result of his yeah. cruel beating of a dog,
yeah.
the person who does the beating of that man,
yeah.
that beating itself, does it carry karma?
Oh yeah, it creates karma as well.
So it's independent of whether or not this karma is, because I can't express it more elegantly, deserved or not by this person. That it's, just because it's a karmic result doesn't mean that the person who gives this karmic result doesn't have his own karma.
Yeah, the person who is sort of the medium or instrument for bringing to fruition that the karma of the man who beat the dog. So that person who beats the man, who hits the man, he is creating new karma for himself, as well as being the instrument for the karma of man, the original man, to mature.
So the fact that he's an instrument has nothing to do with his own consequence, so they're independent?
Yeah, I guess
okay.
so, if I understand.
Thank you.
Okay, so let us end the discussion for today, and we can go over to the meditation section, and we'll conclude with the loving kindness meditation.